This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We've just been talking with Congressman Haley Stevens of Michigan about the crisis on the southern border with immigrants. And now we turn to somebody who has come from Texas, a border state, of course. She's Kay Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. And before serving as ambassador to NATO, she served for 20 years as a Republican senator from Texas. So, Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. You know this situation. These are a lot of your people. We now have El Paso, for example, declaring a state of emergency because of people coming across the border in the South. What is the situation there and what can be done about it?
Well, first of all, David, it is a catastrophe. It is a crisis. These communities have no infrastructure to support the kind of mass immigration that they are facing. The hospitals, the healthcare, keeping them safe, it's just more than a community can handle. And the federal government really needs to step up. I think the administration needs to have a plan, certainly working with Mexico to have a place for these people in their communities. Stopping the influx from their southern border would be helpful. But we also need for the federal government to take the responsibility for all of the infrastructure. And I think President Biden needs to declare that America is a sovereign nation. We are humanitarian, of course, but we cannot absorb this rapid infiltration. And he needs to really put out a plan of action, but also to stop the cartels from knowing that the administration will turn the other eye away and not do what is necessary to secure our borders.
Madam Ambassador, I think you just laid it out exactly right, at least from my perspective. On the one hand, we are a sovereign nation. We have to have borders that are defended that we can control. I think most reasonable people would agree with that. On the other hand, we want to be humanitarian at the same time. Why is it that we find it so difficult to do both of those things at the same time? And by the way, certainly the administration bears a lot of responsibility. I think to really solve the problem, they're going to need Congress as well, will they not?
Definitely. We need an immigration reform. We've known that for a long time. I worked with it when I was in the Senate. I worked with John McCain to try to have a system in place so that we had a regulated system of bringing people in an orderly way, not allowing illegal people to get in front of the line of people who've been waiting for years. We also like to import H-1B visa holders who have skills that will add to America. So we do need Congress to work with the president for a plan. And in this crisis situation, I think maybe a temporary, certainly a diplomatic facility with Mexico is essential, but also working on some temporary maybe job opportunities, not to give them a path to citizenship, but to put them to work to support themselves as we are trying to move people out of the immigration system. Something very temporary, not something that would be a long term, but I think the main thing is the message that has to be sent to Central and South America. But we're getting now illegal immigrants from many other countries, some of whom are carrying drugs. The fentanyl situation is a real one. And it's not even that maybe these people want to bring in drugs, but they may be under the cartel mandate that if they don't, the cartel will injure them or injure their families. And there are so many instances that have been reported of the mistreatment of these people by the cartels. And we have to stop it by enforcing our laws, enforcing immigration now, and then working with Congress and the president together for a longer term solution. But this is a crisis right now that must be handled by the federal government.
Ambassador Hutchison, let's turn back to Europe for a moment, where you spent a good period of time and you know so well. We now have reports that President Putin is visiting Belarus. I think it's one of his only two allies. I think it's Iran and Belarus at this point, or with Russia in their war in Ukraine. How important is this visit to Belarus?
Oh, this is so significant because President Lukashenko is not he is an ally of Putin. Putin is going to pressure him to give a free rein for the Russian troops to set up in that northern part of the border with Ukraine. And I hope that President Lukashenko will repel that. He has tried to do that since this whole thing started last February. He's tried not to get involved, although Russia did go through when they were trying to get to Kiev. But now it looks like Putin is putting pressure on him, and he is saying, I don't want my troops to be involved, but I don't want Russia to invade our country either. So he was an elected president, but the UN and allies have not recognized that as a fair election at all. And so it isn't like Ukraine, which does have a real democracy. And it's going to be very difficult. It's a difficult situation that President Lukashenko is in. And his whole credentials are questionable in the international community.
One last one here, Madam Ambassador, if I could. And we do have a new Congress coming in, and there's been some concern whether the Republican majority in the House will fully support Ukraine with further armaments and further support. Do you have any doubt in your mind as a Republican?
I have no doubt in my mind that our Congress will support Ukraine, Republicans and Democrats. It's very bipartisan. Of course, there are people on both ends of the spectrum that have questioned that, but the vast majority in Congress, bipartisan, understand the importance of our staying the course with Ukraine. If we said, oh, never mind, and walked away, that would give Putin a green light to go into Moldova, Belarus, and whatever he thought he could get by with. I think the strength of the Ukrainian people right now has been so impressive, and President Putin is now putting more and more pressure on them. We must stick with the Ukrainians to keep Putin from marching beyond Ukraine and thinking that he can get by with this and the West will buckle. We're not going to buckle. This is for freedom and sovereignty, and we must stay the course.
Madam Ambassador, always such a treat to have you with us. And by the way, happy holidays to you. That's Kay Bailey Hutchison. She's former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Still to come, we're going to talk with another former U.S. ambassador. This one is the one to China, Gary Locke, about the state of the COVID crisis in China and what it could mean for the economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we're now into the next to the last trading week of the year, it's time to check on the markets, and we have Kriti Gupta to do that. So I keep hearing with the Santa Claus rally. I'm not seeing it yet.
Yeah, you're not probably going to see it for a couple of days. Remember, the Santa Claus rally is supposed to be the last 5 trading days of the year.
So you always tell me that, and I always forget it.
Because I'm constantly reminded of it by a lot of equity strategists. But it's important to know that one of the big questions in the market right now is what is actually priced in when it comes to the carnage that we've seen here in 2022. Right now, the S&P 500 down about 0.6%. The NASDAQ really taking it on the chin, down 1.2% as well. And you're seeing this across the board, a 10 basis point move higher in the 10-year yield. So even bonds are selling off. And when you see that happen just across the board from commodities, although I will say that some of the crude markets are actually a little bit higher, but mostly a lot of the currencies, bonds, and stock market are all down. That really just tells you that a lot of people are liquidating ahead of the holidays. It's a question of a lack of participation as opposed to some sort of fundamental driver.
What are they scared of?
Well, they're scared of a real slowdown in profits. And that's once again coming to the issue of what is actually priced in. Are we pricing in a recession in 2023? The growing consensus said actually that's the part that isn't priced in. Then we still have another leg to fall when it comes to the S&P 500 because the recession has yet to hit. And so far, the market has only been pricing in these Federal Reserve rate hikes. At least that's the argument of, say, Mike Wilson, for example, who is admittedly a known bear. So that is going to be the question. At what point do you start to have to take into consideration the earnings declines, which a lot of people are saying hasn't really been something that's been quantified in the stock market yet?
Yeah, I must say, the thing that I find even more puzzling than even the earnings thing is the bonds. Because a lot of people are saying now it's finally time to go back into bonds because you're getting real yields. And
Yeah.
yet, at least today, they're not going back into bonds at all.
Well, we were actually just talking to on Bloomberg Radio to Liz McCormick about this very topic. There seems to be a consensus here that because Fed cuts are actually priced into the market, you are going to start seeing some of these yields capped, and the further out that goes, the yields will get higher.
Fascinating. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time when she'll be anchoring on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up next, we're going to talk to Gary Locke, the former U.S. ambassador to Beijing, about what's going on with COVID in that country and what it could mean for the Chinese economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. I want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Lisa Mateo, who is here with the first word.
Thank you, David. Well, Bloomberg has learned that FTX co-founder Sam Bankman-Fried has indicated he's prepared to be extradited to the U.S. as soon as today. He's been locked up in the Bahamas since last Monday when U.S. authorities accused him of fraud and other crimes. If he's convicted on all accounts, Bankman-Fried could spend decades in prison. Members of the European Union have reached a deal to cap natural gas prices. And that ends month of political wrangling over whether to intervene in the energy crisis. Starting February 15th, gas will be capped at $190 per megawatt hour. The cap is designed to prevent extreme price swings. And there's a suspicion that China is hiding the true scale of fatalities from COVID. More than a month after a huge increase in COVID cases, China has reported only 2 deaths. Now that defies the experience of other more vaccinated places with better resources. In a Twitter poll, Elon Musk asked users whether he should step down as the head of the social media platform. Well, more than 17.5 million votes were cast, and almost 58% said Musk should quit. Musk had said he would abide by those results. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I want to pick up on that story Lisa just told us about, some of the doubts about the numbers coming out of China with respect to COVID, and particularly COVID deaths. To get a sense of what we think is going on in China, because we're not sure, we turned out to Gary Locke. He's former U.S. ambassador to China, former Secretary of Commerce, and former governor of the state of Washington. So thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Ambassador. So what do we think is going on in China? How reliable are the statistics that we're seeing?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, David. China is a very secretive society, and we really can't rely on any of the numbers, just as we really couldn't rely on China when the pandemic first broke out in terms of the severity of the pandemic. And had we had more information, the world would have been able to respond much sooner. But China is relaxing all their restrictions, and that's going to create a lot of chaos. And it's estimated that just within the next few months, they could have over 1 million deaths just within the next few months, with all the holidays and all the travel that the Chinese will be embarking upon over the next few months. And so with the relaxation of restrictions, and it's really confusing, in some places, authorities are saying, even if you test positive, you can go to work. Well, that's going to create even more mayhem and I think uncertainty. And you're going to see inconsistent reactions and protocols and lockdowns by local governments and states, or what they call provinces there. It's going to, well, a lot of the factories will resume, but can they really run at full operation if many of their people are out sick?
Well, you make a very important point, Mr. Ambassador, and that is that it was thought the problem was the zero COVID policy. The government wouldn't let you go back to work. Now it looks like they're letting people do it, but the people are not willing to leave for fear. So they may have some of the same effects on their economy, I would assume.
Yes, they may not have official lockdowns or quarantines and restrictions on people moving, but individual companies and maybe individual local governments may do the same. And they're unprepared. The vaccination rate is very low, so their elderly are very much at risk. And even the vaccines that they have are not all that effective. And they've refused to use the Western vaccines, which have proven to be so much more effective.
You mentioned in passing some of the holidays coming up. The Chinese New Year is coming up, typically in early February, and as I understand it, that is a major source of revenue for the economy overall. As so many people go back home, they travel and they spend a lot of money. What kind of effect could that have on the economy of China if, in fact, that is substantially dampened?
Well, it's the Chinese Lunar New Year, and this time it's in the latter part of January. And you have so many people who actually live and whose families are in different cities, different provinces, different states. And so they might be working 500 to 1,000 miles away. And so during the holidays, they go back to reunite with their children and their parents. And there's mass travel on the trains, the airplanes, on the roads, the buses. And that's where you could risk a huge infection. That's the Chinese are actually predicting, and health authorities are predicting a huge wave during the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday travel. Of course, people, when they do go home, they're taking their savings that they've accumulated from their jobs. They're giving gifts of money to their children and loved ones, and of course, buying gifts. So that's going to spur the economy. But if everyone's afraid to travel, if businesses have been shut down, and they have been shut down for many, many months, people's income, disposable income in their pockets is much less than what it was before. So it may not, the spending during the Lunar New Year may not be as high as previously encountered.
So what does this all mean, do you think, Mr. Ambassador, for President Xi, who's looking to start his third term as president of China, sort of an historic moment here? What does it mean for him and his relationship with the people, his relationship with the leadership?
Well, certainly, President Xi and his top government officials have been responding to the huge protests that have broken out throughout China over the last several weeks and months. People are agitated over these very strict lockdowns where entire neighborhoods, entire cities are shut down. You cannot go to work. You cannot go to the grocery store. You cannot even go to the hospital if you're sick or go see a doctor. You can't visit friends. If a single person in the neighborhood or huge parts of the city have come down with COVID. So that's why you've had so many businesses shut down, which is why our supply chain is worse than it ever could have been. And so many things that Americans depend on, whether it's the clothes and the things that we buy at the stores, to tools, to iPhones and games, those have been in short supply here in America because of the restrictions within China, because so much of what we purchase as Americans is made in China. So while the government has relaxed these restrictions in response to the protests by the people, the government is really unprepared on how they're going to cope with free travel, open travel, people milling around, interacting with each other, and definitely coming down with COVID, especially the possibility of 1 million people dying of COVID in the next few months in China. I mean, in America, our deaths are a little over 1 million, but that was over a 3-year period. Now, they're expecting a tidal wave of deaths and illnesses just in the next few months.
And in the meantime, talking about U.S. relations with China, there were some hopes that maybe some progress would be made after President Xi's meeting with President Biden over in Bali. There were talk about the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, going over. I believe that Treasury Secretary Yellen is on her way over. Do you have a sense of where that is and whether it's moving?
Well, after the summit between the two presidents, there was a commitment to try to restart some diplomatic exchanges and conferences and communication, including climate change talks. We have so much that we need to work with the Chinese government on, whether it's stopping North Korea from developing a nuclear weapon, to fighting cures for the most dreaded diseases like cancer, tuberculosis, and obviously climate change. So it's good that these initiatives, these contacts, these partnerships between the United States and China are beginning to resume, but it takes a lot of planning before anyone will actually go over, before they actually discuss very, very important matters.
And as a practical matter, from your experience over there in Beijing, dealing with the leadership, can they move forward on some of those difficult fronts as long as they're facing a COVID crisis? Because that must be distracting the leadership to some extent.
It is very distracting, but they can move forward and they have to move forward. There's no reason why talks on climate change, reducing the carbon emissions coming out from China cannot proceed. while the local government officials are grappling with COVID or while they're trying to vaccinate their senior citizens. So there's no reason why they cannot, why many of these initiatives cannot move forward simultaneously.
Okay, Mr. Investor, it's always such a treat to have you with us. Thank you. That's Gary Locke. He's president of Bellevue
Thank you, David.
College and former U.S. ambassador to China. Coming up, the House Select Committee on January 6th is about to vote on recommendations for criminal prosecution. We'll talk through the political implications with our contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. A very short time from now, actually, we're going to have the final meeting, I guess, public meeting of the January 6th Select Committee in the House, looking into what happened when they invaded the Capitol. And the question is, what will they do, but also what ramifications will it have politically, even more than legally? To take us through that, we welcome now Bloomberg political contributors Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University. So I'll turn to you, Jeannie. Obviously, this is good for history. We sort of have learned a lot from this. There's a lot on the record. That's good for the history books. What difference will it make in the here now?
You know, they are going to do these criminal referrals. It will be the first time, if they do refer the former president on insurrection and on conspiracy and on corruption, the first time we've ever seen that happen. It's not going to have an impact legally. The Department of Justice, you know, is investigating already, so it won't have that impact. But I do think it's critically important for history, and also because, let's not forget, some of the people who are going to be mentioned in this report we expect are currently in power in Congress. People like Kevin McCarthy, people like Scott Perry and others. So there's people still in power in the United States who are part and parcel of this referral and what we expect is this report. And the other thing I would say is I think this committee really changed the way we see committees, a select committee like this. I mean, this was more like a TV show. They used insiders to make their case, and it was effective, David Weston.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm chuckling, Rick. When was the last time we made something better by making like a TV show? I'm just not sure if that's an improvement.
This is the new age of Congress, right? It's really not about the substance at all. It's about whether it's made for television. And this was made for television. I mean, this was a story that needed to be told in a way that it isn't your typical hearing. And that's exactly what they did. They staged this thing in a series of, special events. And I do think, though, following down the trail of who gets impacted by this, it's not going to be good for Kevin McCarthy, right? So here he is running for Speaker right now, and he's going to have a bad news day with the January 6th Commission. And it does give more work for the special prosecutor at the Justice Department. I mean, he's got to sift through the 1,000 interviews that this committee did and decide whether or not that adds or subtracts from his case. So it's going to create an enormous amount of work in the heels of today's report.
So let's talk about Kevin McCarthy. You raised him, Jeannie. He's got something of a tough time, it looks like, right now. Is he going to get to be Speaker of the House? And is Donald Trump, the former president, helping him at this point or hurting him?
You know, I think Donald Trump has hurt him. Donald Trump is the reason he's in this position. I mean, historically, he should have had the 60-seat majority he thought he was going to get. And then these 5, never Kevin folks wouldn't be able to hold up the entire caucus. But here we are. He's got his supporters wearing these OK Kevin buttons. And of course, who wants to be described as just okay? I mean, that's about as good as it's going to get for Kevin McCarthy. And imagine if he gets what he wants and he's elected Speaker. Wow. How long is he going to be able to lead this caucus, especially because I think he's going to have to allow them to vote him out, or one member to be, allowed to vote him out. So I think he's in a very weak position in the best case scenario.
Yeah, I think he starts out weak. This is an embarrassing situation for him. He fell to Trump right after the election and said, "I need your help. I can't do anything without you." And the reality is he hasn't been able to. He hadn't been able to lock the deal in, and it took Trump coming out publicly to lobby these 5 insurrectionists, so to speak, the ones who are holding off the support of Kevin McCarthy. And it'll be a huge embarrassment to Donald Trump if they don't cave. So he only needs one. I got to give him credit. He's probably going to be Speaker, and he's probably going to get one of them to cave, and he'll get elected with 218, not more. And I agree with Jeannie. I think that really begins the most difficult part, not getting elected, but then governing this unruly coalition. Nancy Pelosi showed it could be done. She has an equally tough caucus, but he's going to have to prove that he's up to that task.
Okay, let's have a pool. How many speakers in the next Congress? How many speakers will
In
there
the
be?
next 2 years, you'll have probably 3 Republican speakers.
3. What do you think, Jeannie?
I think at least 2. I've got to do something different than Rick, so I'm going with 2, but he's probably right on 3.
One other thing about the former president, Donald Trump, tomorrow, I guess, the House Ways and Means Committee is going to make a decision about releasing those tax returns. How important is that, and what do you think we're going to learn, Jeannie?
Yeah, it's taken them 4 years. Some people say longer than the Civil War for them to get their hands on these tax returns. It's a bit late. I'm not sure how much we'll learn, but they're going to be voting tomorrow on whether they release those publicly. I think they will. One thing to watch is whether the Senate takes those up next year. They didn't follow the House in trying to get these documents, but now that the House has them, they may take them. But I think the real question for Americans is, should Congress pass a law requiring candidates to release their tax returns, which Donald Trump's famously decided not to do? I think that's the bigger question here than Trump.
And should Congress pass such a law?
No, I mean, this is a tradition that dates back a long time. It's clear that Donald Trump suffered a bit by not presenting his tax returns. But the last thing we ought to do is start legislating conduct on a presidential campaign trail. If you don't present your returns, you get a couple strikes against you. It's a calculation that campaigns have to make in the future. My guess is, after what Donald Trump's been through, no campaign would not give up their tax returns at this stage.
Oh, so this is speculation, and we shouldn't be doing that, but let's do it nonetheless. Did Donald Trump fight this hard because the number was so big, the number was too small, or there was something fishy?
Well, he's on the record saying he was trying to evade taxes as long as he could, and only suckers pay their full share of taxes. So I got to believe it's a small number. The question is there any illegitimacy to it, right? Did he do anything in his taxes that people would see as violating any of the laws?
Jeannie?
Yeah, this is like Goldilocks, I guess, right?
Exactly.
I'm going with too small, but you know what? Anything in there can't be a surprise at this point. I mean, nothing he does is surprising at all. But the reality is there's questions about how we go forward from here. And it's not only tax records, it's also, I know Rick's not going to like this, it's also health records. Should top presidential candidates be required, if they're going to serve us, to release health records as well? I'm not going on the record on that. I'm just saying those are considerations.
I think you just
Caveat.
I'm not sure.
Caveat emptor. Let the voter beware.
There you go. Okay, we'll discuss that in another segment. Actually, Rick and Jeannie are going to be staying with us as we turn to the situation on the southern border as Title 42 is about to expire. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and the city of El Paso, Texas, has declared a state of emergency because of immigrants coming across the border, and it's expected only to get worse when later this week that Title 42 exemption kicks in. It's a real problem all across the country, and to take us through exactly what the politics of it are and why we can't get this fixed, we turn now to political contributors Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. I'm going to turn to you, Rick, because you worked for so many years with John McCain, the late Senator John McCain, and I talked to him as well. He was really very informed and very passionate on the question of immigration.
That's right. And what he supported was comprehensive immigration reform. So not only do you control the border, which is important, but you create, guest worker visas that allow people who have jobs and have the ability to help our economy to come in, and a process for those who want to be qualified as, future citizens. And then the people who are now crossing the border illegally, they come in last, right? And so you create a process to do that. And that's what we've been missing. So lacking a process, it's every man and woman and children for themselves crossing the border. And you create these enormous problems on the southern border, only to be alleviated by shipping migrants all over the United States. In fact, the mayor of El Paso has been sending thousands to Chicago and New York, and this is no way to run a country, no way to run an immigration program.
So, Jeannie, I'll say, as I listen to Rick, that sounds eminently sensible, and it's obviously a huge crisis. And yet, I don't know if you saw Peggy Noonan on Wall Street Journal over the weekend. She said neither party really wants to deal with this problem.
Neither party wants to, and they're disincentivized to address it. And that's the real problem. So you have Republicans who are using it as a political cudgel. They're doing that effectively. You have the Biden administration, who I think has, now 2 years in, can no longer blame the Trump administration for this situation. Title 42 goes away on Wednesday. The mayor of El Paso, even the governor of California, they're saying the results will be dramatic. We may see 5,000 to 6,000 people crossing the border per day. These border communities cannot deal with it. Even here in New York City, you have the mayor, Eric Adams, saying we can't handle it. So we are a sanctuary city. We can't handle these people coming up. But there's very little incentive to address the problem. And the reality is, in the new 118th Congress, they will not deal with it beyond trying to impeach the Department of Homeland Security head. And that is not going to address the problem.
Yeah, that's not going to fix the problem.
No.
So, Rick, where's the political fail here? I mean, normally in a market, at this point, you say there's a market failure going on.
That's
where's
right.
the political failure going on?
It's
here?
lack of political courage. It's exactly what Jeannie was saying, is people see this as something to avoid, not something to lean into. George Bush had a comprehensive immigration policy when he was president. Ronald Reagan had a comprehensive immigration policy when he was president, and it resulted in what people call, the great amnesty. But at least he had one. And we haven't seen for 25 years any president really put the credit into managing this process through Congress to try and get it done. John McCain, we talked about earlier, had a partner in Ted Kennedy. 2 lions of the Senate were the last best chance we had of a comprehensive immigration plan. And so now who's going to step up? Who's going to take action? Because we can't ignore our southern border, and it's more than just building a fence and hoping for the best.
So, Jeannie, I know it's awfully easy for us on the outside to second guess the people who are actually doing the work. At the same time, Joe Biden ran for president. It was pretty obvious this was an issue. This was going to be an issue. He criticized actually what his predecessor, Donald Trump, had done. And yet I'm not sure I understand what the Biden immigration policy is right now.
They do have a plan they've put forward lately. It's been the 6-point plan to address the lifting of Title 42. But to your point, and I agree with you, Trump blamed his predecessor, Obama blamed Bush. I mean, it keeps going back. We did have Kristen Sinema, and we did have Tillis come out with a plan, widely ignored, that would have at least addressed the Dreamers, who are in a horrific position, and done some for border security. That's been ignored. So this is a problem that is writ large in Washington, D.C. It goes well beyond. But I think we see Joe Biden go to the border. At least I would advise him to, not that he'd listen. Today, he should be at that border. He should never have been in Arizona the other week and said he didn't have to go there.
I hope he's listening. Thanks to Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue for a second hour on Bloomberg Radio. We'll talk to Victoria Coates, former National Security Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa. This is Bloomberg.